Hello. Today I want to talk about a classic book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002 and is the first person to win this prestigious award as a psychologist. As a kid, Daniel Kahneman was caught in the middle of the German occupation. Back then, young Jewish kids like him had to wear badges in public, marking them as Jewish. One night he hung out at a friend's house and lost track of time, violating the curfew for Jews. Scared out of his wits, he turned his jacket inside out to hide the Jewish badge and walked cautiously. Just then, a German officer approached. Kahneman felt like a dead man walking. However, instead of reprimanding him, the officer gave him candy, asked his age, and even drove him home. Before leaving, the officer mentioned he had a son Kahneman's age and let him go. This blew Kahneman's young mind. He realized that people aren't always what stereotypes make them out to be. Even in a world where Jews saw Germans as monsters, here was a man who showed kindness. This life-changing experience drove Kahneman to dive deep into psychology, focusing on the irrational sides of human behavior. Economics often operates under the assumption that people are rational beings. You know, the classic supply and demand curves. Higher prices, less buying. Lower prices, more buying. Then there's game theory, where every move has a counter-move. But let's be real. How often do people actually apply these theories in daily life? More often than not, we act irrationally. Take Daniel Kahneman's peak-end rule, for instance. This idea came from a not-so-pleasant study involving rectal exams. I don't need to tell you that these exams are far from a walk in the park. They're downright painful. Imagine you're the patient, and this scope gets inserted. You're in hell for about 10 minutes until it's over. Now, another scenario. Same initial 10 minutes of agony, but then the doctor leaves the room for a bit and you have to endure a little more mild pain. So, who do you think had it worse when it's all said and done? You'd think that those who endured a longer, more painful rectal exam would be the ones dreading another go at it. But guess what? When asked if they'd do it again if they had to, the ones who suffered longer were more willing. Welcome to the peak-end rule, which says that we judge experiences mostly by how they end, not by the total sum of good or bad moments. There's also this thing called duration neglect, where we pretty much forget about the middle part and focus only on the start and finish. So, when it comes to shaping our opinion about something, it's the end that counts. This peak-end thing is everywhere. Watch a movie with a bad ending, and you'll trash the whole film. Have a love affair that ends in disaster, and you'll write off the whole relationship as a flop. The same goes for life. You can't really say if you've succeeded or failed until the final curtain call. That's where the irrational side of us kicks in. Though rationally speaking, you'd weigh the total amount of pain. It's really how you felt at the end that sticks with you, thanks to the peak-end rule. So let's take a deeper look at why this weird psychological quirk exists and how it reveals our irrational tendencies. Trust me, by the end of this book, you'll be floored by how little you actually know about yourself. So why is the book called Thinking Fast and Slow? It's because our brain has these two ways of processing stuff, which Daniel Kahneman labels as System 1 and System 2. Take System 1. If someone glares at you with a furrowed brow, you instantly know they're ticked off. No need to pause and ponder. It's like your brain's knee-jerk reaction. Ask yourself, what's 3 plus 8? You instantly say 11, right? That's System 1 doing its thing, quick and easy. But let's say I throw you a curved ball and ask, what's 28 times 13? Now you gotta stop and do the math in your head. That's when you realize that good old System 1 can't handle this one. You need System 2 to kick in and do the heavy lifting. Both of these systems are buzzing around in our brains. System 1 is like your brain's cruise control, quick, effortless, and pretty much on autopilot. It's like you're the rider, and System 1 is the elephant you're riding on. When you're cruising along, life feels easy because System 1 is doing all the legwork. All right, let's talk about System 2. This is your brain's heavy lifter, dealing with complicated stuff that needs some serious mental elbow grease. Think calculus problems or making tough choices. Now, we've all gone for walks where we're lost in thought, right? If what you're thinking about is simple stuff, like planning your day, you can walk and think no problem. That's System 1 taking the wheel. But let's say someone comes up and asks you something big like, "What's your game plan for your speech tomorrow?" Chances are you'll stop walking. Why? Because you've got to switch off autopilot and bring in the big guns, System 2, to concentrate on this brain buster. If you find yourself stopping mid-walk, that's a dead giveaway. System 2 is clocking in. I actually tested this out myself, inspired by Daniel Kahneman, who did the same. When walking at a normal pace, your mind can juggle lots of thoughts, even planning a lecture for the next day. But try speeding up your walk on purpose, and bam, it's like your brain hits a wall. You can't think about complicated stuff anymore. So, that's the lowdown on System 1 and System 2 in our noggin. When System 1 hits a snag, it can't untangle, it tags in System 2 for backup. Let's say you can easily add 3 plus 8 but get stumped on 28 times 13. That's when you call in the big guns, System 2. One telltale sign you're shifting into System 2 mode. You stop dead in your tracks when you're walking and you get all serious. Even your pupils start to dilate. In fact, there was this cool experiment where they tracked people's pupil sizes. Turns out, whenever folks were wrestling with tough questions, their pupils would start to grow. You can even see this in action at the movies. By watching the audience's pupils, you can tell how gripping a film is. If it's a real edge-of-your-seat thriller, those pupils will keep on expanding. Talk about a fascinating quirk of psychology. When System 2 kicks in, it's like putting on blinders. It zones in on the task at hand and tunes out everything else. Remember that classic psych experiment, the invisible gorilla? Folks were asked to count how many times a ball was passed. After, they were asked if they saw a gorilla. No one had a clue what the researchers were talking about, but replay the tape and bam! A guy in a gorilla suit was right there, dancing and all, and almost everyone missed it. Why? Because when you're less focused on counting those passes, scared to mess up, your brain's System 2 goes into tunnel vision, shutting out everything else. Our brains are wired to be efficient, or let's just call it what it is. Our brains are lazy. They don't want to work harder than they have to. And that's why it's so easy for people to get duped or brainwashed. Many people get stuck in a rut in life because they're too lazy to engage their brains. Charles T. Munger said it best in his book, Poor Charlie's Almanac. If you want to be good at golf, you can't just swing away and hope for the best. You need training and practice. The same goes for using our brains. If you're always on mental autopilot, you're not gonna learn anything new or challenging. Take communication skills, for example. Books like Nonviolent Communication, As We Speak, and Crucial Conversations all teach methods that require you to really think before you speak. This is how learning works, but too many people just let their instincts take over in daily life. They get mad, they sulk, and they go through life reacting instead of thinking. That's a surefire way to get stuck in life. Why? Because they're not using their System 2, the part of the brain that handles the heavy cognitive lifting. We all have this bad habit of wanting to save mental energy. Why? because thinking is hard work. There's this cool study that looked at how often parole judges approved bail. What they found was super interesting. Judges were most likely to say yes right after they'd had breakfast or lunch. The lowest approval rates. Right before noon and before 5 p.m. What gives? Well, it turns out they were just tired and hangry. When you're low on fuel, making good decisions is a real struggle. You're less willing to think hard about whether someone should get bail or not. So the default becomes no bail. So here's a pro tip. If you've got an interview or some application that needs approval, try to schedule it when you know the decision maker will be at their freshest. Because running System 2 isn't just a mental drain, it's an energy drain too. Understanding how System 1 and System 2 work gives you some awesome insights into everyday situations. Take cognitive ease, for example. This happens when someone's in a chill environment that doesn't require heavy thinking from System 2. They're more likely to kick back and relax. This book helped me get why I hate reading books with lousy printing. When you're reading something that's well printed, you're in this relaxed mental state. It's like, I can read this book no problem. But if the book is blurry or has typos, suddenly your brain kicks into high gear. Your System 2 wakes up and you're like, whoa, this is tiring. That's why bad books feel like a chore. It's pretty wild, right? And get this, cognitive ease also makes things that are familiar to you seem more believable. Psychologists call this the exposure effect. If you want to win someone over or get them to see things your way, being a constant presence in their life is key. It's called the exposure effect. The more they see you, the more they chill out around you. And you become like family. Just think of The Shawshank Redemption, where the guy keeps writing letters to get a library. He's ignored at first but sticks with it, and eventually people get used to the idea. Ever notice how someone you thought was unattractive when you first started working together starts to look better after a few years? It's because you've gotten used to them. Your brain doesn't have to work overtime evaluating them anymore. That's System 1 and System 2 at work. Knowing this is a game changer, especially when you realize how much we all love to put our brains on cruise control. A lot of folks aren't clued into this brain science. So, what's their go-to strategy? They use shortcuts or heuristics to make decisions. For example, if someone asks how much you donate to save endangered species, you might not have a clear answer. Instead, you think about how sad a dying dolphin makes you feel and donate based on that emotion. It's a way to simplify a complex question. Or if someone asks if you're happy with your life, you basically gauge your current mood. Feeling good? Then you're happy with life. Feeling bad? Then you're not. And don't even get started on trying to predict the president's popularity in the next 6 months. That's anyone's guess. People often simplify complex problems, and that's where they go wrong. For example, questioning the usefulness of reading. You might think, well, I know someone who reads a ton but isn't rich, so reading must be pointless. That's just taking a shortcut to an easy answer instead of dealing with a complicated issue. Once you get the hang of how our mental systems 1 and 2 work, the next thing you'll want to know is how these shortcuts, or heuristics, can skew our thinking. Take the case of kidney cancer rates in the US. Some statistics showed that areas with low populations had higher rates of kidney cancer. People were quick to jump to conclusions, blaming it on things like inadequate healthcare or poor diet. But the real reason, it's all about the law of small numbers. In sparsely populated areas, the sample size for any study is going to be small, which makes the results more extreme. So one year you might see a high death rate, and the next year it could plummet. It's not a reliable statistic, but most folks don't even know about this law. Lots of people don't really get statistics, so they're quick to make assumptions. Take Florida, for example. It's said to have the highest death rate in the US. You hear that and think, I'm never living there. But plenty of people are moving to Florida, a hot vacation spot. Why? It's full of wealthy seniors, so of course the death rate's higher. We often lean on shortcuts or heuristics to make quick judgments, but that can lead to biases. One classic bias is the anchoring effect, which can really skew our perceptions. In one study, students spun a rigged roulette wheel that could only land on 10 or 65. Then they were asked to guess what percentage of UN countries are from Africa. The students who spun a 10 guessed an average of 25%, and those who hit 65 guessed an average of 45%. It just goes to show how easily our judgments can be swayed. You can see that the predictions ranged widely, from 25% to 45%. Where did that huge gap come from? It's all down to a psychological trick called anchoring. Sometimes even a small hint can serve as an anchor. Take a supermarket experiment, for example. Psychologists put canned goods on sale and initially just advertised the discount. Later, they added a sign saying, "Limit 12 cans per person." That's an anchor right there. Once the 12 cans anchor was set, they found that people bought an average of 7 cans each. Before the limit, the average was less than 3 cans, so purchases more than doubled. The point is, when you set an anchor, like the number 12 in this case, you guide people toward it. So, when you're in a negotiation and the price hasn't been set yet, the person who throws out the first number, the anchor, usually gains the upper hand, because they set the starting point for negotiations. Daniel Kahneman advises that if you're in a negotiation and the other party throws out a high anchor number, you're pretty much stuck with that anchor in your mind. The best thing to do, slam the table, walk out, and return another day to talk. Why? Because you're already anchored, and it's best not to negotiate any further that day. Plan to set your own anchor next time. So how can you escape this mental trap? The book, Getting More: How You Can Negotiate to Succeed in Work and Life, offers some insights. For example, if I'm at a flea market, it doesn't matter what price the vendor suggests. I only offer $50. It takes a strong mental game to break free from the anchoring effect, which is also a form of heuristic bias. There is also a concept called utility cascading that can lead to social anxiety. This is when a not-so-serious issue gets exaggerated and becomes a big deal, something we're all too familiar with. It's a prevalent phenomenon that tends to capture increasing attention and cause escalating concerns. In the 1960s and 70s, the Love Canal disaster made headlines. Factories were dumping waste into a canal, and rainwater eventually brought this waste to the surface. Reports started coming out that the area was toxic, and the issue snowballed into a national crisis despite the lack of concrete evidence on the waste's impact. Similarly, there was a scare in the US about Allah-treated apples. A chemical was used to keep apples bug-free and shiny. When an organization claimed this chemical was toxic, it led to a widespread boycott of not just apples, but all kinds of fruits. This is a classic example of utility cascading, where an unconfirmed risk can trigger escalating social anxiety. It's a byproduct of human irrationality and heuristic biases. Often, we simplify what we see as the solution to a complex problem because we lack the ability to fully understand that problem. You see a terrifying headline and think, better safe than sorry, I won't eat that. And that's how societal biases are born. The author, who served in the Israeli military, once taught a class to the Air Force about training top-notch pilots. He stressed that the key to improvement is praise. When you affirm what someone does well, they're more likely to excel even more. During the lecture, an officer in the audience challenged Kahneman, based on his own experience. The officer claimed that praising a pilot for good performance led to worse results the next time, while scolding a pilot for poor performance improved their next outing. In response, Kahneman acknowledged the officer's observations as valid, but also profoundly flawed. He explained that this was not an effective training approach. Instead, the fluctuations in performance were more likely due to a statistical phenomenon called regression to the mean, rather than the impact of praise or criticism. The concept of regression to the mean suggests that people often confuse correlation with causation. For instance, if you rebuke someone and they improve, it's tempting to think your scolding caused the improvement. However, that might not be the case. You're likely to scold someone when they're performing below average and praise them when they're doing exceptionally well. But can anyone sustain peak performance all the time? So when you praise someone for doing great and they subsequently revert to average performance, it's easy to jump to the conclusion, oh, they can't handle praise. This misconception often takes root in childhood. Many parents say, the moment I praise you, you start showing off, implying that praise can't be handled well. But the truth is, you were praised because you were performing way above average. Naturally, reverting to the mean is to be expected. The officer's misunderstanding that his praise led to poorer performance is a classic example of irrational thinking. And what if the officers remained skeptical of Kahneman's explanation? It would be a challenging situation for any regular trainer, especially when your audience consists of military experts, and you're not an expert in Air Force training. How do you even start to explain? But Kahneman is no slouch. He's a Nobel laureate in economics, so he came up with a clever demonstration. He drew a target on the wall and asked each of the officers to take 2 coins. Turning their backs to the target, they tossed the coins to see how close they could get to the center. After recording the outcomes, the point became abundantly clear. Those who nailed it on their first throw were less accurate the second time around. Conversely, those who were way off initially improved on their second attempt. This is a classic example of regression to the mean. Many things we assume to be the result of hard work or specific patterns are often just cases of this statistical phenomenon. And when does this occur? It happens when there's no direct cause and effect relationship between 2 sets of performance. If someone's work has a direct impact from one task to the next, like in an assembly line, then regression to the mean won't come into play, as there's a causal link. However, in situations where performance isn't directly linked to prior actions, take golfers for instance, experienced commentators often notice that a player who was on fire yesterday might not do as well today. When Daniel Kahneman hears a commentator explain this, he thinks, this person gets it. They understand the concept of regression to the mean. It's a good reminder to be mindful of our biases, especially those induced by shortcuts in our thinking or heuristics. If we're not careful, this lack of understanding can lead to overconfidence and poor decision-making. A classic example is hindsight bias, where people claim, "I saw it coming, didn't you?" Interestingly, the worse the outcome of an event, the more pronounced this bias tends to be. For example, after the tragic events of 9/11, there were countless rumors suggesting that the US government had known about the attacks in advance. People said things like, "Come on, the terrorists only have a few tactics. We totally saw this coming." But here's the question. Why didn't anyone speak up sooner? Why weren't there articles or discussions with the US president before the events unfolded? This hindsight bias is a psychological trap we fall into, fueled by overconfidence and an over-reliance on our intuitive System 1 thinking. Take the book Build to Last, for instance, which claims to have distilled the keys to corporate success based on extensive research. So what did further investigation reveal about the so-called success formula in Build to Last? Daniel Kahneman and his team did a follow-up study on the exemplary companies featured in the book. They found that the performance gap between these companies and their less successful counterparts in terms of profits and stock returns nearly vanished over time. Another book, In Search of Excellence, also showed that the average profits of the companies it featured declined substantially in a short period. Even more striking, a Fortune magazine survey found that the worst-rated companies had higher stock returns over the past 20 years compared to the most admired ones. It's a stark reminder that when we think we've figured it all out, it's often just hindsight bias in action. Far from revealing any real secrets to success, it's more likely that we're just fooling ourselves with an illusion of overconfidence. Things like this are really hard to predict. Take running a successful business, for example. It's an incredibly complex undertaking. Trying to boil it down to a few simple rules is just that, too simplistic. This taps into what we discussed earlier about heuristics. When you can't solve a complex problem, you might think that achieving a few simple tasks will solve it for you. It's a quirk in how our minds work. Our brains are both a marvel and a mess, a paradox that's hard to resolve. Daniel Kahneman is of the opinion that the future is fundamentally unpredictable. He's had first-hand experience in this area through his work in the Israeli military. His job was eerily similar to tasks many people do in their daily lives. In an effort to identify potential leaders, they would set up an incredibly challenging task: move a 6-meter-long wooden log over a 2 to 3 meter high barrier and make sure everyone also climbs over the log. Talk about complexity. The tricky part was that the wooden log couldn't touch the barrier. It had to be entirely held up by the team members. The task was daunting, and it would cause the whole team to struggle. It took an enormous amount of time and energy to get the first person over the barrier, then the second one, and so on. The last person would be pulled over by those already on the other side. Throughout this grueling exercise, observers could easily identify who had leadership qualities, communication skills, work ethic, and a sense of dedication. Scores were given based on these observations. Daniel Kahneman was involved in this project and initially thought it was an excellent way to identify future leaders. It seemed so clear-cut. You could almost instantly tell who had the leadership material. Yet, when they followed up on the progress of these soldiers years later, they found that their long-term performance had zero correlation with those initial evaluations. Daniel Kahneman's research revealed that attempting to forecast the future using simplistic metrics is not only unrealistic, but also unpredictable. This was glaringly evident in the world of stockbroking. Brokerage firms hire experts to recommend stocks to their clients, and their effectiveness is gauged by the subsequent performance of those recommended stocks. After conducting a detailed regression analysis, Kahneman's team found that the correlation between the broker's recommendations and actual client profits was a negligible 0.01, virtually zero. When Kahneman presented these eye-opening findings at a conference, stating that these brokers didn't really add any value for their clients while still charging hefty fees, the room grew uncomfortably silent, and he was politely escorted out. The takeaway was stark. You'd be just as well off letting a monkey throw darts at a board to pick stocks as you would following expert advice. The reason? A monkey throwing darts would give every option an equal and unbiased chance, whereas experts often bring their own set of overconfident beliefs, biases and fixations, making it impossible to predict future performance reliably. While many experts offer valuable insights, predicting the future based on simplified rules is generally tricky. However, there are some domains where prediction can be quite effective. Take newborn baby care, for example. It's vital to pay close attention to a new baby's health to avoid life-threatening situations. Dr. Apgar introduced a quick 5-point checklist that covers heart rate, breathing, responsiveness, muscle tone, and skin color. Healthcare providers can swiftly evaluate these 5 elements to gauge a newborn's health, offering a reliable predictive measure. Similarly, in the world of wine, many French connoisseurs rely on their senses to predict wine sales, which isn't a particularly reliable method. Then someone came up with a more scientific approach, using 3 key variables: the average temperature during the growing season, the amount of rain during the harvest, and the total precipitation of the previous winter. By turning these intuitive factors into a formula, they managed to accurately predict wine prices for years and even decades into the future. When the predictive formula for wine pricing was introduced, industry experts laughed it off, some even resorting to insults. However, the simple formula ended up being far more accurate than the experts' gut feelings. So, when should we put our faith in experts? According to Daniel Kahneman, there are 2 conditions. First, the subject matter must be inherently predictable and follow consistent patterns, like wine cultivation or newborn healthcare. Second, these patterns should be learnable through long-term training. Under these conditions, experts can be invaluable. For instance, in games like chess or poker, experts can quickly discern the likely outcome due to the clear rules governing these activities. The same holds true for professionals like doctors, athletes, and firefighters. Their predictions tend to be much more reliable than those of laypeople, precisely because their fields are trainable and follow specific patterns. Conversely, areas like the stock market, politics, real estate prices, individual growth, and fortune-telling are notoriously hard to forecast. Many times what we think works is simply a misunderstanding of the phenomenon known as regression to the mean. Another pitfall comes from overconfidence, leading to what's known as planning fallacy. These skewed decisions, born from overestimating our capabilities, can create a host of issues. One classic case involves excessive optimism when we're mapping out future plans. We're naturally inclined to value our own choices highly, which can make us overly optimistic. To counter this, there's a tactic known as the Premortem method. Daniel Kahneman learned about the Premortem approach at a high-level conference. How does it work? Imagine you're about to sink $200 million into a new project. Before you commit, you gather everyone for a meeting where you operate under the assumption that the project has already failed. The team's task is to figure out why it failed, essentially conducting an autopsy before the project even starts. This pre-mortem strategy can effectively curb much of the excessive optimism that often clouds decision-making. I recently stumbled upon an online post mentioning that Jack Ma often holds a peculiar meeting with his team titled "How Alibaba Went Bankrupt." While some may find this odd or even amusing, it struck me immediately as a classic example of the Premortem technique. So if you're about to plunge into a venture filled with excessive optimism and confidence, it might be wise to perform a premortem. This can serve as a reality check, helping to minimize the risks of poor decision-making driven by overconfidence. So that's the third major section of the book. The fourth section delves into decision-making and risk. One of the cornerstone ideas in Daniel Kahneman's work is the prospect theory, which challenges our traditional notions of rational decision-making. Let's explore this with a simple example. Imagine you're offered a coin toss where heads will net you $150, but tails will cost you $100. Should you play? According to classic theories of rational behavior, you'd be foolish not to play since the odds are in your favor. However, when you pose this question to most people, they opt not to play, stating that $100 is a significant loss they're not willing to risk. So why do people shy away from an opportunity to make money? A closer look at the psychology behind these decisions can be revealing. The curve representing people's attitude toward gains and losses is asymmetric, symbolizing the essence of human irrationality. Daniel Kahneman suggests that if there were a flag for irrational behavior, this curve would be it. Why? Because people psychologically value gains and losses differently. For example, the psychological pleasure of gaining $100 might only be 1.5 times its actual value, whereas the psychological pain of losing $100 could be as much as 3 times its value. This concept is known as loss aversion. Loss aversion is a foundational concept in Kahneman's prospect theory. When making decisions, you can't just rely on simple calculations. You need to consider the emotional intensity that people associate with potential outcomes. So, what would it take for you to engage in a gamble like this? Many people say that if they risk losing $100 when it lands on tails, then they'd need the chance to win at least $200 if it lands on heads to consider participating. In an intriguing experiment related to the Endowment Effect, 2 individuals were given a choice. They could either receive a $10,000 bonus or take 12 days of vacation. Unable to decide, they agreed to flip a coin. After the coin toss, one was allocated the $10,000 and the other the 12 days off. A few days before actually receiving their respective rewards, they were asked if they'd like to swap, given that they might have second thoughts about the outcome of the coin flip. What happened? Neither of them wanted to trade. The individual who won the $10,000 felt that the money was already theirs and was reluctant to part with it due to loss aversion. Similarly, the person who was granted 12 vacation days felt that those days were too valuable to give up. This behavior can be attributed to a mental process of rationalization. Consider the act of buying a home. Once you've invested in a property, you're likely to find countless reasons why it's an ideal place to live. Friends may question your choice of a remote location, but you'll be thoroughly satisfied, listing myriad advantages. This phenomenon, known as the Endowment Effect, is a prime example of human irrationality. Another concept to consider is mental accounting. Let's say you and I decide to attend a sporting event. I shell out $200 for a ticket, while you receive one for free. On the day of the event, a blizzard hits. Who's more likely to skip the game? Clearly, you'd be more willing to forfeit your ticket. Yet the value of both tickets is the same. They provide the same access to the same event. So why would I brave the blizzard to attend while you'd easily let it go? The answer lies in mental accounting. Because I've spent money, the ticket has a different emotional value in my mind. Although mental accounting is an example of irrational behavior, it's a very real psychological phenomenon. When you're trying to influence someone's choices, cracking their mental accounting can be a tough nut to crack. This goes beyond simple cost calculations. Take stock trading as an example. Most people tend to sell off their profitable stocks when they urgently need cash. The sale feels justifiable in your mental ledger. However, when it comes to stocks that haven't performed well, you hesitate to sell. Why? Because you don't want to admit a trading loss, even to yourself. So you hang on to the underperforming stock, letting its value diminish further. This tendency all boils down to the influence of mental accounting. So what's the upside of understanding these psychological frameworks for decision-making? They can guide us in structuring deals or choices more effectively. Let's consider a hypothetical scenario. The US is bracing for a rare disease from Asia that could potentially kill 600 people. You're presented with two strategies. Strategy A guarantees saving 200 lives, while strategy B gives a 1/3 chance of saving everyone, but a 2/3 chance of saving no one. Most people, myself included, would go for the sure bet, strategy A. But what if we reframe the options? Strategy A ensures 400 deaths, and strategy B has a 1/3 chance of 0 deaths, but a 2/3 risk of 600 deaths. Interestingly, now most people, including me, would lean towards strategy B. Why the change? When framed in terms of potential loss, people are more inclined to gamble. This is a key takeaway from prospect theory. When you emphasize what's at stake in terms of losses, people are more willing to roll the dice. Even though the choices in both scenarios are essentially identical, the framing changes everything. The weight we give to gains and losses in our mental ledger varies, causing us to make divergent and often irrational choices based on our risk aversion. Though the options are the same, how they're framed makes people choose differently. When there's something to gain, people lean towards a sure thing. When facing potential losses, they're more willing to gamble. This psychological tug-of-war is vividly illustrated in legal settlements. The party seeking compensation is often willing to settle for a little less, say $8 million instead of $10 million, because they're focused on what they stand to gain. Conversely, the party expected to pay is more inclined to risk a court battle. They think, why agree to lose $8 million when there's a chance I could win? They're willing to roll the dice because they're focused on what they could lose. This discrepancy in decision-making is a testament to how differently we value gains and losses. So, why delve into this book? It's about gaining a richer understanding of ourselves. While this academic tome is filled with intricate case studies, we've only scratched the surface here, discussing the most relatable examples. Consider this a starting point for deeper self-discovery. We're far more complicated than we often realize. You could read this book alongside Poor Charlie's Almanac to gain a holistic view. While Munger's book shows how to capitalize on human irrationality in business, this one guides us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. The first step is recognizing the roles of System 1 and System 2 in our decision-making, which helps us avoid herd mentality. Unlike many self-help books that offer quick-fix tools, this one goes deep into the complexities of the human mind. It introduces the concept of System 1, our brain's autopilot, and System 2, which kicks in for more thoughtful analysis. Our brain's default setting is to avoid hard work, which often leads us to irrational decisions. This laziness can result in heuristic shortcuts and biases, causing overconfidence and poor choices. That's why business leaders like Jack Ma use methods like premortems to anticipate future challenges, applying insights from prospect theory. So, what's the takeaway? This book serves as a window into understanding our irrational selves, helping us become more self-aware. While we may still make irrational choices, at least we'll know where we went wrong, and that's a step in the right direction.